In the previous lecture, I gave you just the briefest little snapshot of divine command theory and pointed out some of its features that philosophers point to argue that it's a really useful theory for us to use in developing our own ethical framework because it allows us to identify a value of importance, right? What God wants, what God values, as the foundation for our ethical framework that we can then use to justify the various moral claims that we make. But there are some folks who argue that divine command theory isn't just useful, it's actually necessary for there to be any kind of meaningful morality. They would ask us a question like this: can the moral world make any sense without God? In other words, if we assume that we exist in a godless universe, is there any way that we could have a meaningful morality in that universe? And they might specifically point to this concept of obligation. And they would ask us this: if morality refers to an obligation to do or not do a certain thing on a certain occasion, from where does this obligation come if there is no God? Now, think about the concept of obligation. What is it? An obligation is something that you're required to do or required to not do. You're compelled by something to either do something or not do something. Okay? And what these folks are asking is, well, where does the nature of this compelling force come from if we're assuming a godless universe? And we might respond and say, well, sometimes I'm obligated to do something or not do something because I'm being threatened by somebody. Somebody's got a gun to my head, and therefore I feel compelled to do whatever it is that they're telling me to do or not do. Or perhaps I have some things that I'm compelled to do or not do because of the law, right? And the threat of punishment. So I'm obliged to not drive over the speed limit. Otherwise, I risk a traffic citation as a form of punishment. But there's lots of things in our lives that we have to grapple with that are not going to be dealt with by the law, right? Or dealt with by somebody who has the ability to physically force us to do something. Okay, so whether or not I help people who are in need, I'm not forced to do that by law. And if somebody forces me with a physical threat to do that, I can't really be said to be doing the right thing. I'm just doing it out of fear, not because there's anything that justifies actually helping those in need. So these folks are asking us, well, where does that obligation to help those in need come from? And the best we could say, they claim, is that it comes from some cultural expectation. But how do we even justify that? Okay? These folks might ask us also, if we exist in a godless universe, why would we fulfill an obligation that causes us to suffer if there's no God-threatening punishment or offering reward? In other words, why would I ever be altruistic? What would be the reason for me to do something that helps others, that doesn't help, and may even harm me? Why would I ever do that? Okay, what would be the rational reason for doing that? Okay, very famous philosopher named George Mavrodes. I've linked a copy of one of his pieces in our Canvas site for you to read. And one of the things he says in that essay is this: the best thing to say is that were it a fact that we had such obligations in a godless world, then the world that included such a fact would be absurd. We would be living in a crazy world. Okay, so this isn't to say that divine command theory doesn't have its weaknesses. It does. It certainly has its uses. It certainly has its justifications. But it also has, like all of the theories we're going to look at, it also has its weaknesses. One of those weaknesses is that a belief in God is prerequisite to embracing the divine command theory. Okay? So in other words, the divine command theory rests on the assumption that the God that establishes moral authority in the universe is an actually existing God. Now, if we're in a group of people who were all raised in the same faith that this God exists, then maybe things work out fine. But as you know, there's lots of people that are raised without any kind of faith. And so therefore they have to come to their beliefs by leaps of faith, or more commonly by rational means. They have to do the really hard work of investigating the logic of a supreme being and then coming to the conclusion that such a being exists and that we can know what exactly this being wants from us. And that can be a big lift for a lot of people. And even if we're able to successfully get people to make that big lift, the other question that we would have to answer is, well, which God are we going to assume is the moral authority of the universe? And which religious text do we think represents the intentions, the wants, the desires, and the values of this particular God that we've identified? And of course, even when we identify which God and which religious text, now we've got this problem of ambiguity. Religious texts have ambiguity in them. In other words, they have assertions that can be read in multiple ways. So, for example, in the book of Genesis, Noah, of Noah's Ark fame, is said to be a good man for his time. What the hell does that mean? Does it mean that in Noah's time, everybody else was a total dirtbag, and Moses was just okay, he was a good man for his time, but maybe in another time he wouldn't have been a good man? Or does it mean that given the challenging circumstances in which Noah lived, he is a good man to be dealing with these challenges? What does that mean? And there's lots of that kind of ambiguity in religious texts. There's also the fact that religious texts are oftentimes silent on some ethical issues that we face. What do religious texts say about artificial intelligence? Of course, we've got this philosophic problem that some have identified, starting with Plato in his dialogue using Socrates 2,300 years ago, called the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma essentially says this: if something is the right thing to do simply because God commands that thing to be done, then doesn't that mean if God commanded something else to be done, that that thing would be good? So yeah, God says that stealing is wrong, but if it's wrong simply because God says so, then doesn't that mean if God had said that stealing is morally permissible, that it would be? Okay. Now there's a way out of this kind of trap, but nonetheless, this is going to be a hang-up for some folks. And then finally this: if I do something if I sort of blindly do something simply because I'm told that's what God wants me to do, is that really an expression? Are my actions really a meaningful representation of my authentic moral self? In other words, if I'm just a rule follower, does that really indicate anything about my character? Okay, so these are some of the weaknesses of divine command theory, and what we're going to have to do is see if we can figure out an alternative path to establishing a foundational value that we can use as the basis of our ethical framework without assuming that God exists.